Hello. We'd like to welcome you from all over the world to today's Schiller Institute International Conference. The title of our conference is 100 Seconds on the Doomsday Clock. We need a new security architecture. We're going to begin today with a musical selection, Johannes Brahms's Sonata for Violin and Piano in A Major, Opus 100. We're playing the second movement of this, and this is being done by Norbert Breinien and Gunther Ludwig. Violinist Norbert Breinien was a very close friend of Lyndon LaRouche, who we are the founder of the Executive Intelligence Review magazine and a co-founder of the Schiller Institute. He shared with LaRouche not only a good sense of humor and a good joke from here on occasion, but in particular a breakthrough around the idea of motivic thorough composition. This was a very specific idea that Norbert had worked on for much of his life, and he discussed this with Lynn. It had to do with some very important ideas, which we'll probably hear a little bit more about during the course of the second panel. But I will just want to point out that when Lyndon LaRouche was incarcerated unjustly, Norbert Breinien held concerts in defense of his friend and colleague, Lyndon LaRouche. His approach to music and LaRouche's approach to politics as a form of art were nearly identical. And so, without further discussion, second movement, Andante Tranquillo of the Brahms Sonata for Violin and Piano, Opus 100. If you've just joined us, we want to welcome you to today's Schiller Institute International Conference. The title of our conference today is 100 Seconds on the Doomsday Clock. We Need a New Security Architecture. And you have just heard the second movement of the Brahms Sonata for Violin and Piano in A major, Opus 100, played by violinist Norbert Breining and pianist Günter Ludwig. This year has been declared by the Schiller Institute and the Friends of Lyndon LaRouche to be the year of Lyndon LaRouche. Mr. LaRouche, who passed away on February 12th of 2019, would have been celebrating his 100th birthday this year. He was a co-founder of the Schiller Institute. He was the founder of Executive Intelligence Review magazine, and he was a leading economist and statesman of his time, we argue. Importantly, he was a private citizen who decided that it was important for him and other private citizens to play a role in international affairs and to play that role on behalf of the institutions, not only of the American presidency, but all institutions that reflected the idea of a humanity that progressed and developed and did that from the standpoint of the idea of the general welfare, Roosevelt's idea of the common good of mankind, but more importantly, the ideas of great people such as Friedrich Schiller, Gottfried Leibniz, and others. We'd like to begin today by showing a brief excerpt from Lyndon LaRouche's discussion about how he thought of the meaning of human life.
So what do you live for? Do you live like an animal to go out with a whimper? Or do you live like a human being knowing that you are doing something, you are developing in yourself, something which will be transmitted to future generations to make humanity better in the future? You no longer are a little person living in a little neighborhood with a little mind, with little ambitions and little interests. You suddenly become a very big person because you have the minds of some of the greatest people in history before you live in you, in your replication of what exactly their act of discovery. You do things with pride to say, he was right. This was a great discovery. We've got to use it for mankind's benefit. You say, I've got to do something to make the future better for those who come after us. And I can die with a smile on my face because I've lived well. I've lived at peace with the greatest people of the past, or at least some of them. And I can live at peace with joy in the people of the future. I will live forever in this process. That's what it is to be human. And when you think like that and look at other people like that, you don't have a problem. You may have problems, but that's fun. Because if problems force you to attack and solve problems, whether as an individual or in conflict with others, that is fun.
We are now in our Schiller Institute conference, 100 Seconds on the Doomsday Clock. We need a new security architecture, and this is panel 1. Who and what are driving the rush toward world war? How close are we? Today's circumstance, which I think everyone who is on this conference is well aware of, is in fact eerily similar to a circumstance of 22 years ago, and is significantly different than what we, or many of us, may believe today's circumstance is. Lyndon LaRouche, from the vantage point of 22 years ago, explains.
On the 12th of October, August, a Saturday, a Russian major vessel, a submarine, the Kursk, was sunk in the Barents Sea. Some hours later, the location of the sunken submarine was located, and in the following hours, the President of Russia, President Vladimir Putin, telephoned the President of the United States, Bill Clinton. They met by phone. There were discussions with the respective military groups, advisors on both sides. the two presidents discussed, and thermonuclear World War III was avoided. That's the fact of the matter, the essential fact. Now, this situation, which still continues, a continued and escalating threat of thermonuclear and other war, now spreading about the planet, is a condition which I addressed a little more than 11 months ago. What you're seeing is a war in the North Caucasus region on southern Russia. What you're also seeing is a war which is broken out simultaneously in the border between Pakistan and India. The forces behind these attacks on Russia and on India are the same. They are a mercenary force which was first set into motion by policies adopted at a trilateral commission meeting in Kyoto, Japan in 1975. The policies originally of Brzezinski and his number two man there, Samuel P. Huntington. The policies which were continued by then Trilateral Commission member, that is back in 1975, George Bush, before he became vice president. These are policies which were continued by George Bush as vice president. This is under Bush, became known as the Iran-Contra drug finance link operations of mercenaries deployed with private funding all over the world, recruited from Islamic and other countries, and targeting Russia's flank. This mercenary force, that's it, just the beginning. But in that film, I did not, of course, indicate the sinking of the Kursk. And though I did, the crisis associated with the sinking of the Kursk, which if Bush had been president, or George W. Bush Jr. had been president, would probably have led immediately to World War III. So obviously you don't want George Bush for president at this time, under those conditions. But what I forecast was a condition which already existed, a condition which in the later part of the films I indicated would continue, has continued, would worsen, had worsened, and we are still headed toward some kind of catastrophe which could be thermonuclear World War III or something equally bad. And there are things which are equally bad. The point is that what has happened now was the inevitable consequence of policies to which I referred then. Policies which have a deep root in U.S. foreign policy from the 1970s. These were the policies of the Carter administration. These were the Bush policies of the Reagan administration, as far as Bush was running part of the show then. These were the policies of the Bush administration. These have been the policies of the United States government under the Clinton and Gore administration. Continued. Clinton may have objected to this. Clinton may have acted this recently to prevent this from becoming an aggravated crisis in conjunction with President Vladimir Putin. But Clinton has done nothing to lessen the danger of this global warfare. If Gore were to become president or Bush, war or similar kinds of global catastrophe would be inevitable. That's the problem we face, because the policy structure which is in place in the United States and generally in the world today ensures a drive of civilization toward a collapse, worse on a global scale than the New Dark Age, which struck Europe during the middle of the 14th century. Now, contrary to some people, you don't bet on wars. You don't go to your bookie and say, I want to make a bet on whether war breaks out or not. War is not an event. A condition like the sinking of the Kursk is not an isolated event. This was not an incident. There was not a Kursk incident that provoked a crisis. There was a crisis in which the sinking of the Kursk occurred, a strategic crisis. There was a response to the crisis. There was a response by two presidents, that of Russia and the United States, to the accentuation of the crisis associated with the sinking of the Kursk. But do not speak of a Kursk incident. History doesn't work that way.
You are now at the conference 100 seconds to midnight on the Doomsday clock. We need a new security architecture. We are beginning panel 1, who and what are driving the rush towards world war? How close are we? To give our keynote speech, we have Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute. His title is, What Happens After D-Day? Will Russia invade Ukraine? Harley?
Well, thank you, Dennis. I'd like to open this panel by welcoming everyone to the dawn of a new era, as it's becoming increasingly clear that the post-Cold War era of unipolar dominance enforced by US NATO military, the so-called rules-based order, is coming to an end. The question, which we're taking up today, is whether it will be replaced by an era of peace and economic prosperity, protected by a new strategic architecture committed to the security concerns of all sovereign nations, or is ended by the desperate defenders of the unipolar order in a war which can wipe out humanity. The present escalation over the Donbass, in which there are claims of shooting and skirmishes, combined with the heavy US official deployment into Europe at the Munich Security Conference, with NATO meetings, with G7 meetings, and so on, all charging that Russia intends to invade Ukraine, shows that war is still on the agenda of the transatlantic forces. President Biden himself yesterday said that he's convinced that Putin has made the decision to invade Ukraine. But that doesn't change the fact that the unipolar era is coming to an end. This is not something which was unforeseeable. In a series of statements, articles, and webcasts over the last 5 decades, the American economist and statesman Lyndon LaRouche insisted that that order, which was consolidated on August 15, 1971, with President Nixon's actions ending the post-war Bretton Woods system and replacing it with a speculative financial system of floating exchange rates, could not survive without resorting to Shaktian or fascist economic policies, which would require military force to impose. His 1971 forecast was confirmed with the bloody coup in Chile in 1973, which overthrew and murdered the elected President Allende and brought to power the Pinochet military dictatorship, which used brute force to impose the free market reforms of the Chicago Boys, who were directed from the US by a network run by well-known synarchist George Shultz, who played a leading role in shaping US economic and strategic policy from the early 1970s until his death last year. The Chile operation was a test run for many similar regime change coups and a model for transition to free market policies, including that of the shock therapy imposed on Russia by the same networks following the collapse of the Soviet Union in December 1991, and those running the Ukrainian economy after the February 2014 Maidan coup. Those who benefited from these so-called transitions were largely the looters operating in financial centers in the City of London and Wall Street. Another among many prescient statements from LaRouche was issued by his presidential campaign on April 28, 2003, titled A World of Sovereign Nation States, which includes comments highly relevant today in examining the present strategic crisis. In that piece, he examines the post-9/11 policy implemented by the Bush-Cheney administration. He writes that the administration rejected one variety of imperial intent, the softer version of the British liberal imperial model, and adopted instead an approach which was a more direct echo of what he called the Roman imperial model, or that of the Nazis. This reflected the change which occurred after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when the decision was made by the West to reject an effort to achieve a mutually beneficial economic partnership with Russia, and instead pursue the construction of a unipolar world order. This was heralded by such things as President George H.W. Bush's proclamation in the flush of victory against Iraq in Desert Storm that we are seeing the emergence of a, quote, new world order, unquote. Secondly, the arrogant thesis of Francis Fukuyama that the so-called victory of the West in the Cold War over the Soviet system represents the end of history, meaning the triumph of the Anglo-American version of free trade and democracy, enforced by the unilateral power of the US military. A third example of this was the outlook of the Project for a New American Century grouping of neoconservatives, which launched the endless wars after 9/11, typified by Cheney, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, and Kagan. The characteristic statement of this crowd, which had been sponsored with funds and policies generated by the military-industrial complex of US and British corporate cartels, was George W. Bush's statement, an implicit threat to the world in launching these wars, that, quote, either you're with us or with the terrorists, unquote. LaRouche wrote that the adoption of this Anglo-American assertion of total supremacy demoralized our European allies. Even as they might resist the threat implied by application of this doctrine, which is that if you challenge this order, you will be the target, they wavered, as he said, quote, out of fearful regard for the hope that they might minimize the risk of becoming a virtually declared adversary of the USA, unquote. In this statement from 2003, he said that there could be resistance to these policies from nations which would be strong enough to intervene. He identified France, Germany, Russia, and China, but added that the change must come from the United States. This later became the basis of his proposed four-power alliance of China, Russia, India, and the United States, which in combination had the power to overcome the concentration of force in the hands of the global cartels responsible for running that increasingly disastrous policies imposed by those running the post-Cold War order. This order has been shaken by events of recent years, starting with the financial collapse of 2007-2008. The attempt to paper over growing volumes of unpayable debt of all categories, which was adopted under the Obama administration and carried out by leading central banks, was capable of producing new bubbles, but not of generating a real economic recovery, because that was never the intent. The wall of money policy was designed to bail out the speculators, while hollowing out what LaRouche called the physical economy of nations. But one must never mistake liquidity for solvency. The latest everything bubble began collapsing in September 2019, and the attempt to protect the bloated, worthless financial assets on the books of the leading banks, insurance companies, hedge funds, pension funds, etc., with a great reset, implies a new global financial system under the dictatorial control of central banks, under which all nations must surrender their sovereignty. This is something that Russia and China will not do. Likewise is the resistance to the global Green New Deal, which is based on the fraudulent idea of man-made global warming, which the same elites of the rules-based order say can only be combated by accepting a zero carbon emissions policy, which would put an end to use of efficient forms of energy production, such as fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas, and elimination of nuclear power. But at the COP26 conference in November of last year, there was a rebellion. Yes, there was lip service paid by many to the need to eliminate carbon-based energy production, but this is being rejected in practice. An example of this reaction is President Macky Sall of Senegal, the chairman of the African Union, who said of the agreement signed at COP26 that it is not workable. He said more than 800 million Africans need electricity, and it will not be provided by the green technologies promoted by such phony projects as the European Union's Global Gateway program. The unipolar order has also been shaken by the disastrous results in the endless wars conducted by the US and NATO. And this is most significant. Trillions of dollars have been spent, millions of lives lost, continuing up to today, as the sanctioned regimes imposed by those who launched the wars continue to threaten millions with starvation, lack of access to health care, fuel, etc., as in the case of Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, Iran, and many other countries. There's a growing moral outcry against these wars, while those who launched them are looking for cleaner ways to kill, as with the just concluded Operation Global Lightning. So finally, we get to the present crisis, with Ukraine at the center. It's not about Ukraine, as much as it is about the demand from Russian President Putin that the post-Cold War encroachment of NATO through eastward movement threatens Russian security and must end with a return to the agreements reached in 1997. What has enabled Putin to make his demands now? Demands for no NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia, no NATO offensive weapons deployed to Ukraine, and a diplomatic resolution of the solution in eastern Ukraine based on implementing the Minsk agreement, is that advances have been made in science which have allowed for a significant increase in the power of the Russian military. And secondly, the growing alliance with China, which is the other major target of the unilateralists. The consolidation of this relationship between Putin and Xi Jinping, between Russia and China, during their February 4th summit, created an in-depth panic, actually hysteria, among leading figures committed to the unipolar order, as can be seen in two statements. First, from the Daily Telegraph on February 4th, in an article titled, "Russia and China Rise from Their Knees to Challenge US Dominance." If we could put that up on the screen, please. This is from the Daily Telegraph, which is sometimes called the Daily Torygraph, given its closeness to the ruling elites of the City of London. They write, "The message from the communique issued is anything but routine. At a moment of immense international tension, Russia and China are asserting the arrival of a new geopolitical era. From now on, the dominance of the US-led global West will no longer be taken for granted or tolerated," unquote. Now, even though this was in the British press, it's a true statement. Then we have one from Fred Kemp, the CEO and president of the Atlantic Council, one of the leading pro-war think tanks, which was created in 1961 to keep the United States under the geopolitical direction of the British and the British Empire. He issued a statement February 6th titled "The Audacious Putin-Xi Compact." Here's what he said. "This is big. The two leading authoritarians of our time have declared unprecedented common cause. perhaps even a de facto security alliance, with aspirations of shaping a new world order to replace the one fashioned by the United States and its partners after World War II. Note that he leaves out the role of the British in that. Then he continues, yet for all the two countries' historic animosities and considerable remaining differences, perhaps never in their history have they been closer. And never since World War II have the leading authoritarians of their time been so strategically aligned or personally close at a time when both are deeply contemplating their legacies. Note that he's comparing Putin and Xi to Hitler and the Axis powers in that statement. And then he continues, what unites Russia and China remains mostly their opposition to the United States. They've cynically appropriated the concepts that define US foreign policy: democracy, human rights, and economic development, though their actions are ridiculously inconsistent with their rhetoric. One might ask Kemp, where is democracy in the regime change coups run by the West? Where are the human rights of the Afghan people? Where's the economic development in the International Monetary Fund policies imposed on poorer countries? What is actually threatening to Kemp and others is the idea of Eurasian integration, which is what is proceeding with the Russian-China alliance, which is going to be extended, whether they like it or not, at some point, to Eastern and Western Europe. This is what's seen as a casus belli for nearly 2 decades, since Halford Mackinder codified this in his theory of geopolitics. What the likes of the editors of the Imperial Daily Telegraph and Fred Kemp will never accept is that what Putin has requested in the form of treaties with legally binding security guarantees has been made necessary due to the broken promises and hostile actions against Russia, beginning with the refusal to live up to the promise of no eastward expansion of NATO, made repeatedly in talks in 1990, and recently confirmed by the US ambassador to Russia in that period, Jack Matlock. Matlock wrote that he was there when the pledges were made. It's also the case that Putin's stand has emboldened others, such as former French Foreign Minister Roland Dumas, who stated in an interview this week that he was also there when the promise was made to Russian leaders. For those such as Blinken, Boris Johnson, Stoltenberg, and others, to deny that those promises weren't made or don't count because they were not written is the kind of lawyer's argument that undermines the credibility of those who made the promise. Perhaps this is why Mr. Blinken is forced to repeat the same gibberish over and over about Putin's alleged intention to invade Ukraine, and how we must have unity to protect European security. It is clear in the recent visits to Moscow by French President Macron and German Chancellor Scholz that they have not been swayed by the repetitions of Blinken. Instead, as we are living in a most turbulent moment, caught between hope and fear, the words spoken by a Chinese representative at the UN in a debate on the Ukraine crisis can resonate with all peoples. The diplomat described the tension over Ukraine as something not inherent in the Ukraine situation. But he said, in the refusal of the US and NATO to renounce the mentality of the Cold War, which is an echo of Helga Zepp-LaRouche's insistence that one country's security cannot come at the expense of another's. This is what the call for a new security architecture means. This is what Lyndon LaRouche, his wife Helga, and the Schiller Institute have fought for over many decades. And now it is in our hands, as citizens of nations, to make sure that such a new security architecture, which guarantees mutual security, can be realized. Make no mistake about it, The unipolar era has ended, even though Antony Blinken and his war hawk sidekicks have not gotten the text message on this yet. Let us resolve to replace it with one which represents a commitment to protect the lives of all humans, defend the sovereign rights of all nations, and give every child an opportunity to fulfill their God-given potential in a world of peace, development, and mutual benefit for all. Thank you.
And thank you, Harley. Our next speaker is Natalia Vitrenko of Ukraine, Chairwoman, Progressive Socialist Party of Ukraine, and her topic is Ukraine's role in present world affairs.
Уважаемая Хельга, уважаемые участники конференции.
Dear Helga, dear conference participants, it is very important that our conference is taking place in a period of heightened confrontation between two blocs of leading countries in the world. This is the NATO countries, led by the USA, and the other bloc, which is taking shape before our very eyes, is Russia and China, whose joint declaration of February 4th of this year proclaimed their intention to be together on all issues. This is extremely important because mankind is on the brink of World War III, and the knife's edge of that confrontation is my country, Ukraine. Essentially, this is what we warned about. Let me remind you about my intervention at the European Parliament on February 26, 2014. That was during the tour by representatives of our party, which I believe was very important for the international community when we visited Germany, France, and Italy. Our friends from the Schiller Institute helped us organize that trip. And at that time, I said at my press conference that the coup d'etat in Ukraine in 2014 had brought to power Nazis and Russophobes, and that this would give rise to extremely grave problems, not only for Ukraine and not only for the Eurasian continent, but also for the entire world. And indeed, from 2014 on, the USA started strongly sponsoring Ukraine and preparing a confrontation with Russia. What other interpretation can there be of the fact that since then, $2.7 billion of lethal weaponry has been allocated? What other interpretation can there be of orienting the government of Ukraine not towards a peaceful solution of the crisis and towards finding ways through diplomacy to resolve this bloody conflict in southeastern Ukraine in the Donbass, but rather constantly instigating them towards war with Russia?
Особенный психоз, милитаристский психоз.
We have witnessed a special kind of militaristic psychosis over the past 2 or 3 months since last fall. As I understand it, the United States gave the go-ahead to all of their satellites so that not only they themselves started pouring an absolute avalanche of weapons into Ukraine, but also the Baltic countries did, and Poland, and Canada, and the UK. All of them suddenly, disturbed about what was happening in Ukraine, and supposedly for the purpose of defending the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine against Russia, started to ship to Ukraine more and more and more weapons. And I emphasize, these are not gifts to our country. This involves loans. The latest loan came from the United States with credit guarantees of $1 billion.
2,5 миллиарда, если пересчитать в доллары, 2,3, если точно.
Great Britain allocated $2.5 billion, or 2 3/10 to be precise, more than $500 million from Canada, 1.2 billion euros from France. And how are these supposedly going to be repaid? What are they to be repaid from? This is a yoke, it's shackles on our people. But that's not even the main thing. The most important is that while the Ukrainian economy is destroyed, our people serve simply as cannon fodder. And the Western mass media constantly hammer away. When the war with Russia begins, the Ukrainian side will suffer losses of 50,000 or 85,000 people. And what is this? This is such heavy pressure on our country, on our people, and such an extremely hard psychological attack on the state of mind of our public that it's absolutely unbearable. It is simply unbearable. So what is happening in our country with the population is a very difficult process. People are packing emergency go bags. They're trying to locate bomb shelters. They're organizing local area defense militias. And it's all without question a blow to the economy. And when a month ago President Zelensky saw all this, even he was dumbstruck, because Ukraine has lost $14 billion just from the beginning of this year. $12.5 billion from capital flight, and $1.5 billion spent by the Ukrainian central bank to support the currency. And let me stress, Ukraine's gold and currency reserves were less than 30 billion, and here you have 14 billion already in losses. There's a collapse of our euro bonds, of Ukrainian state debt. There's a collapse of the national currency, as I already mentioned, and a blockade on international capital. International capital markets are closed to Ukraine. An outflow of investment. And this all has happened literally in the past few weeks. The National Bank of Ukraine has already adjusted downward its GDP forecast for this year from 3.8% to 3.4% growth. What will happen next? People lack resources in our country, even for the basic necessities. Today it was announced that the price of bread will soon be raised by 20 or 30%. And that's when we already, because of brutal pension and wage policies, have the most impoverished population in Europe, with the shortest lifespan. This is what comes from the efforts to set our countries against each other. And that's when Russia has repeatedly said that they have no intention of invading Ukraine. They are doing their military exercises on their own territory. But the Western media, the United States, and Great Britain don't listen to that. Even when Russia reduces the number of its troops near the border, pulling them back to their bases as the exercises finish up, it continues. They say, no, we don't see any de-escalation process. No, we don't trust what Russia says. And what is the purpose? That a war take place without fail. Who is igniting the bonfire of war inside Ukraine and from the outside? Inside Ukraine, it's the Nazis first and foremost. All these organizations that have been reborn and burgeoned, parties, movements, organizations thirsting for blood, they have an ideology called Ukrainian integral nationalism. This ideology was created by Dontsov and Siborsky in the early 20th century, then implemented by Bandera and Shukhevich. This is an ideology of enmity between our peoples, an ideology of war, misanthropic war. This ideology of a Nazified Ukraine has infected a section of the population of our country. And worst of all, this ideology has become the official ideology of the Ukrainian government, just as we warned. And as a result,
русско-культурные люди,
People with Russian culture, members of ethnic minorities, have become second-class people. Look at me. I am ethnically Ukrainian, but my native language is Russian, and I don't conceive of myself outside of Russian civilization. But all broadcasting by Russian TV channels and all broadcasting of programs in the Russian language has been banned in Ukraine. The courts, government agencies, schools, and universities work only in Ukrainian, and we have the constant fanning of the psychosis that the Muscovites, pejorative term, must be destroyed. This is said openly on television. That's inside Ukraine. And outside Ukraine, we see that the USA, headed by Biden, who is supposedly concerned about Ukraine's sovereignty, listens only to the Nazi ideologues' version, what's in their interests. Why does Biden, who talks about sovereignty, not understand that Ukraine's sovereignty was incorporated in the Declaration of State Sovereignty and that our sovereignty was upheld in 2 referendums in 1991? The referendums, one in March and one in December. And since that's the case, Western democracy should have supported democracy in Ukraine. But that means people's power and the will of the people. Read the Declaration of State Sovereignty. Look at what our population voted for. Remember that this was the kind of Ukraine that the international community supported. This was the kind of sovereignty that was recognized as the sovereignty of Ukraine. And it included non-bloc status, neutrality for Ukraine. And it included a union state with Russia and Belarus. If we had had a union state, there would have been no problem with Crimea. Crimea would have remained the favorite child of both Ukraine and Russia rather than being an object of contention. Therefore, today it's important to realize what must be done in order to change the situation radically and not allow a war. I'll divide this into 2 parts, what Ukraine must do and what the international community must do. The top priority for Ukraine is to carry out denazification. What's needed is to help the Ukrainian government with united efforts by the entire world community to ban all parties, movements, and organizations with a Nazi orientation. There are sufficient international norms and principles for doing this. I'll just name the conventions which authorize the international community to help Ukraine in this respect. They are the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It's all spelled out there. A ban on war propaganda, a ban on the functioning of organizations that take a position of racial discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity, or any other criteria. That's what needs to be done in Ukraine. And it's of outstanding importance for Ukraine. And it has to be understood that without the following, Ukraine will not survive. After denazification, the restoration of our non-bloc status and allowing us to implement what was the expressed will of our people, a union state with Russia and Belarus. As for the international side, what needs to be done? Of course, we passionately hope and pray that Russia and China together will be able to convince the USA and Germany to sit down at the negotiating table and work out a new world architecture to find those principles and validate them and put them at the basis of some documents which provide a possibility for peaceful coexistence of different countries with respect for their national interests and distinctive characters. And of course, we need to change the world economic model. We remember how Lyndon LaRouche explained to us that without a radical change in the economic model, there will be no sustained development, and it will be impossible to defend the national interests of different countries. This is what all progressive humanity should strive for, and that is the position of our Progressive Socialist Party of Ukraine. Thank you very much for listening.
That was Natalia Vitrenko, the chairwoman of the Progressive Socialist Party of Ukraine. We're next going to hear from Colonel Alain Corvette of France, the international consultant and former counselor for the French Defense and Interior Ministries. His topic is Evaluation of the Strategic Situation, a French Perspective. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I've not a written speech, but I first want to say that I agree completely with the two speakers who talked just before me. I want to stress the fact that we are at a very specific point in the evolution of humanity, we can say, because I think the crisis of Ukraine is the result of the end of the American supremacy in the world. I don't want to remind everybody, you are perfectly aware of the change in the equilibrium between the nations at the end of the USSR in 1991. This was a great moment. And we can say that starting from this moment, the hubris, the Greek word for the egoism of the United States started, and they thought that it was their duty to lead the whole world. This was obviously a great mistake, but we can understand that at this time, this thinking was possible because there was no other bloc able to balance the power of the United States. But since then, years have passed, and we have seen now that more and more nations are saying to the United States, we don't agree with the way you want us to live, and we have a different pattern of way of living. And now we are powerful enough to say what we want, and you have to listen to us. I will sum up very quickly, but the kind of agreement that Vladimir Putin and the Russian administration sent to Washington in December, saying now it's not possible to go on like this with your nuclear missile at the border of all our frontier from the north to the south. You have put nuclear warheads all over our borders, and this is not acceptable for our security. Then we suggest, said the Russians, that we signed a treaty to come to a new equilibrium between different nations, and especially between you and us Russians. And we should accept and sign a paper saying that we'll never threaten each other. That means it was not written in the treaty suggested by Russians, but it was in the historical presentation of the treaty, it was more or less said that the different treaties that the USSR and the America had signed together have not been accepted by the United States. Then now we need a written acceptance of this treaty. And if you don't agree with that, we will have to take military and technical military decisions, because we cannot accept anymore to have your missile directed to our country. That was the indication that now Russia, together with other countries, because we have to understand also that Russia is not alone. Russia, before sending this paper to Washington, some days before, President Putin met with Narendra Modi from India and with Xi Jinping from China. That means that these countries agree for a new multipolar order. And this paper from Russia is a proposition for a multipolar order, and it is very reasonable, and it should be acceptable by all the nations of the world, because it suggests that nations are not to threaten each other, but on the contrary, to cooperate together. And that's the main project of the Chinese Belt and Road proposition, New Silk Road. And this is the future and the destiny of humanity. It's to stop nations threatening each other and to create a world of cooperation, as General de Gaulle said also in Mexico in 1966, when he spoke to the University of Mexico, but actually was talking to the whole world, saying the future of humanity is there. The nations have to cooperate, and the stronger nation have to help the less strong nations. Then this is a very important thing. I want to remind that the agreement, which was only an oral, verbal agreement in London between the Western Bloc and the collapsed USSR with Gorbachev, with the new CEI at this time, well, the new Russia, they promised not to expand NATO towards East, and especially Poland and Baltic countries. Now we know, and very important German newspaper, I just published 2 days ago, I think, or 3 days ago, I just published the proof of these promises which were made to Gorbachev. And this is a new information which Der Spiegel has given 3 years ago. That's very important also, because on this document, it showed that these promises were made by, were written on a paper, and that's very important. But as you know, as everybody knows, these promises have not been executed. Then I think the Ukrainian situation, current Ukrainian situation, is the fact that the United States did not know how to answer to the exigence of Russian security matters, and they decided to launch propaganda which took a wide range, and especially in Europe and in France in particular, we have seen only the scenarios which were made in Washington, and all the press agencies, all the media repeated the false informations which were coming from Washington. They decided, as they did not know how to answer to the legitimate exigence from Russia, they said, but Russia wants to invade Ukraine. And even if the Putin and other dirigists, Lavrov, Shoigu, said we have no intention to invade Ukraine, the mensonges, the lies were going on, saying the contrary. Then it shows that this is, in my opinion, this is the end of the American supremacy, because they need to have a supremacy on Europe. And if Europe, by chance, come to cooperate with Russia, which is a very big country, and especially for all the energetic resources, of course, this new Eurasia group of countries would be independent from United States. Then we understand that NATO, which was created to face to face the communist world, when the Warsaw Pact was defeated, was collapsed, then NATO should have been also defeated. Then there is no reason now for the NATO to go on and to have all these European countries and others in Asia obeying to the Washington strategy and policy, which have seen that NATO has gone to Afghanistan, to Iraq, and to other countries, to Libya, and so on, distracting completely countries without any reasons, because NATO was supposed to be an alliance to face the communist bloc, and when there is no communist bloc, there should not be any more NATO. Then I want to finish my speech by saying that we are in presence of a very big moment, because I think Ukraine will, the crisis about Ukraine will show the world the end of the American supremacy. Of course, it will not be tomorrow, but it's a sign that now the world does not accept anymore the supremacy of United States all over the world. And especially, I think, for my country and for European countries, that they should understand that NATO has no reason anymore to exist, and that we should leave this organization, which is a war organization for the interest of United States, but the interest of United States are no more to lead the whole world, but they have the dollar. The dollar is now threatened by other currencies, and that's also why the Ukrainian crisis is also an economic crisis, because the United States want to preserve their supremacy with their currency, And this is not anymore possible.
Thank you very much. That's Colonel Alain Corvez, international consultant and former counselor for the French Defense and Interior Ministries. And if you've just joined us, you are at the conference of the Schiller Institute International Conference. We want to welcome everybody from all over the world that is with us. It's called 100 Seconds to Midnight on the Doomsday Clock, Why We Need a New Security Architecture. And this is panel one of that conference. Next speaker is Jens Jørgen Nielsen of Denmark, Why We Need a New Security Architecture. He's a former Moscow correspondent for the Danish daily Politiken and has been an author of books on Russia and Ukraine. And he's the director of the Russian-Danish Dialogue and assistant professor of communications and cultural differences there at the Neil Brock Business School.
But it seems now we're on the brink maybe of a new world war or something, and I think it'd be interesting to try to find out how everything started, how we got there. Because I have an age, I was young 30 years ago, and I remembered we had a new world. The Cold War was over. I grew up in what we call the shadow of the nuclear bomb. We were somehow afraid of the nuclear war, and we were very relieved and very happy when at last the wall came down and we entered a new world. And I was very, very enthusiastic about Mikhail Gorbachev and the perestroika process. And in this process, I actually found my Russian wife. 30 years ago, we got married at this time. So there's a kind of symbolic significance to that we had a new world and we could freely move across any borders. And there was a lot of enthusiasm at this time. So it begs the question, of course, why have we ended up here close to a new war between Russia and NATO? I'm not sure we're that close to it, but it seems for many people we are there. So well, I would have a take on what actually happened, why we entered here. And I would say the NATO, everybody thought 30 years ago that the NATO was a thing of the past, like the Warsaw Pact. Of course, everyone know that Gorbachev was given a promise that if he would accept German unification, NATO will not move 1 inch to the east. And but it didn't go that way. It didn't happen like that way because Bill Clinton wanted something else. And gradually he took new members, Poland, Czechia, Hungary, and other countries into NATO, and presuming that Europe would be much sure. But some of us could not forget the European House, which Gorbachev spoke about. And the Russians were very weak at this time. The Russians were very didn't have any military power, didn't have any political power. So I think the West took advantage to move their sphere of influence further to the east. But Russia eventually became very strong. I would say one thing, George Kennan, for any historian, he's a very important person because he was actually the one who started the old Cold War in 1946 with a long telegram from Moscow where he worked. He warned against Soviet Union. He wanted us to be a deterrence against Soviet Union. But in 1998, he was a very old man at this point. Mr. George Kennan, he gave a very strong warning, and he knew Russia, he knew Soviet Union, he was fluent in Russian, and he warned and said at this time, why should we do this? Because eventually it will end up with the Russians being very angry at us, they will be strong, and we will have a very strong opponent. I think were very wise words at this time. Kissinger, many other people at this time, not left-wing people at all, warned against this NATO expansion and even in Europe, there was also voices who said that we should actually try something new. We should have a new security, indivisible security organization. But European House, which Gorbachev talked about, ended up to be a European House, ended up to be NATO. And the worst thing, I think, is that Russia was deliberately excluded from this. because even Vladimir Putin, when he became president 20-something years ago, he actually wanted Russia to become member of NATO, some very close linked to NATO, but it didn't work out, and he was not allowed. And I thought that if we, at this point, had taken another path in Europe, I think maybe everything would look quite different. Because if you look at it from this point, it seems extremely stupid that we are now close to a war. Secondly, we are using a lot of energy, a lot of financial resources, whilst clever young people will study how to build new weapons and things like that. We could use it in quite another way. So it's a very, very stupid thing we ended up here. So I think it's very important that we scrutinize much more what can we do to change this security architecture, because I think it's a basic problem in Europe that we don't have a proper security architecture. There was a meeting in November 1990 where Soviet Union and East European countries and NATO countries and also NATO pact countries took part in Paris, and they signed a document because of the Paris Accord. It said there very clear that security and peace is indivisible. So you can't have any new organizations against other countries. So we are actually violating the Paris Accords today, it seems to me, because we didn't make this common security architecture. Instead, we have this tension. We have this very bad tension, which seems to become stronger day by day. So what I think is needed now, I think we have to go back to the starting point in 1990 with the Paris Agreement. And we have an organization called OSCE, and I think we could use it much more because Russia is also part of OSCE. At any rate, we need something quite different, because NATO is not giving any security. NATO is not at all, it doesn't guarantee any security, stability. And I think the victim of all this, the first victim, I would say, we are many victims. We are, all Europeans are somehow victims of this process. But the first and foremost, Ukrainians themselves are victim of this policy, because Ukraine is a very poor country today. Actually, the poorest country in Europe at this point, and even now, because of this war propaganda, basically from American security services, I think all investors are flying from Ukraine, and they don't want to be there anymore. So economy is suffering extremely right now. So I think that just because to help Ukrainians and to secure to have more security, both in Europe and in Russia, we have to take quite another approach, how to find a quite new security architecture, so we can have a much more flourishing society, because the potential is there. The potential is here in Europe and Russia for a much more flourishing economy, a much more flourishing society. So I think there is a huge need now for a new way of thinking, because the old way of thinking, I think, is obsolete. It belongs to, I would say yesterday, it belongs actually to the old Cold War. It's the same way of thinking, that Russian is the enemy. We have a strong enemy. We have to have much more weapon, and we have to arm much more, because Russia is threatening us. I don't think that it's a dead end. I think it is, of course, it is possible if there is a will, and I think there's also a will from the Russian side that of course we can make arrangement. We can make some. There's a lot of things we can do, but diplomacy should work much more now, and not the army. And I would even not say not politicians, because the politicians have some very strange agendas in my point of view. So I think now time is more to use your brain, not your heated emotions and things like that. Use your brain and see, are we going the right way? And I think if you do that, I think the answer will be no, we are not. And I also think many politicians now are looking for ways how to open this, how to change this situation. It seems like a deadlock we ended up in, but there are ways to go. There are ways to go. There are ways to solve this problems. I'm not. I do not doubt it at all. Well, I say I would say Bill Clinton plays a role here, because Clinton, he actually decided to extend NATO. He didn't have to at this time. There was many options. There were many people also in America in the elite that had some other points of view at this point. But to my mind, Clinton, he pursued this policy in the 90s. I was a correspondent for a Danish newspaper and Norwegian newspaper in those years. I actually met Bill Clinton at this point, and Yeltsin, and I think that even Yeltsin was angry, because even in 1994, even Yeltsin was angry about the NATO expansion. He didn't like it, and all the old dissidents. I met actually the widow of Andrei Sakharov, Yelena Bonner, and she was appalled. She was very. She certainly did not like this NATO policy of Russia. I think it was a total wrong way to go. So I think now, even in Russia now, because in West, some people think that the Russian population long for America, long for like the West, and think like that. No, it's going in the wrong direction. If you look at it in this way, Russia, the Russian population now is turning against United States first and foremost, and also Europeans. And I think it's a result of this policy. I think it was a temptation. You see, Russia was totally weak. Russia, you had a drunk Yeltsin tumbling around. Okay, you can do anything. I think you have something, you say you can do something because I can. It was possible. There was a kind of vacuum, power vacuum after Soviet, because the Soviet Union left actually without anything. They just left peacefully. There was no battles. There were not one shot was fired when they withdrew. So you could say they were not. Russia was not at all threatening anyone at this point, not at all. And so I think the West took advantage, and I think it's in combination with the fact that there was a widespread illusion that now we own the world, and now the world is open for American democracy, and now American democracy will spread to all of the world, and we have a one polar world, like the Russians call it, and it was an illusion. You remember maybe the book by Francis Fukuyama, The Death of History, and things like that. And there was a widespread feeling that we can do anything, and we can change the world, and not only part of the world, but all of the world. I think these ideas about unilateralism, this idea about one power and one ideology, liberal world order, things like that, we still have it today. People think that the world should be governed by one ideology. It's a liberal democratic ideology, American way, but it's a very dangerous one. Per se, I'm not opposed to it. Not that I don't think you should have the freedom of speech and things like that. But if you want to spread a certain societal structure and a certain ideology and things like that, you end up 100%. You're bound to have trouble sooner or later down the road. Not in the beginning, because Russia was weak, but Russia became strong again. Then we will have the problem.
That was Jens Jorgen Nielsen, who spoke on why we need a new security architecture. We edited his remarks a bit, but he is with us, and we will be able to take questions. He will also be able to amplify additional remarks that he may have had to make at that time. We're now going to hear from James Jatras from the United States, diplomat, former advisor to the United States Senate Republican leadership. And the title of his talk is The Evolution of NATO in the post-Soviet period?
Allow me to say at the outset how honored I am to be invited to take part in this very august discussion about the very, very dangerous situation the world finds itself in right now with respect to European security and the situation in Ukraine. And frankly, one of the hazards of holding a conference like this is anything we might say literally could be rendered obsolete 5 minutes later, given how fast things are moving in Ukraine with the charges and counter charges that are coming from both sides in the Ukraine situation. I think one of the problems we have in discussing this is so many of us are limiting the discussion to Ukraine. Will Putin invade Ukraine, or will he not invade Ukraine? That's the question. And our media in the West, of course, is full of this, which really obscures the issue. And I think one way to try to approach framing it somewhat larger, in a more larger and informative way, is to note that the Polish foreign minister recently was in Moscow and met with Mr. Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. And during those remarks, Mr. Lavrov referred to the withdrawal of the OSCE mission in Donbass, something that was simply done spontaneously, it seems, by the countries that make up the members of that mission. And he drew an analogy to that, to what happened in Kosovo in 1999 after the so-called Racak massacre, which was the pretext, the trigger that was used to unleash the NATO war against Serbia. And he pointed out that the withdrawal of the mission set the stage for hostilities, that once you pull the mission out, it basically opens the door to all sorts of allegations to what may or may not be going on in the zone of intended conflict, because who's there to verify it? That's even assuming you could trust the people who are part of the mission in the first place, but at least supposedly there would be some neutral and responsible eyes to say who's doing what in the conflict zone that we can rely on. Instead, what we have right now are these charges and counter charges coming from both sides, and interestingly, each side accusing the other of preparing a false flag that would open up the hostilities, which is itself somewhat interesting because up until now, even the suggestion of false flags, whether it was Serbian mortars and alleged in Bosnia, or Gaddafi arming his soldiers with Viagra to commit mass rapes, or gas attacks in Syria, just the mere suggestion that countries do such things was treated as a conspiracy theory, something that never happens. Now it seems that Washington has discovered that false flags do in fact occur, and given how much US and also British intelligence services seem to specialize in such things, it's nice to hear them finally admitting that they do occur. I think a lot of the focus on Ukraine specifically obscures the deeper question here, and that is the Russian demand for security guarantees regarding the expansion of NATO, and that the process of NATO expansion will be shut. There will be no more countries admitted to NATO, expanding that alliance toward Russia's borders. Just in the last day or so, Russia has responded to the American response to their demand for security guarantees, and basically told them the same thing that President Biden said in his remarks at the beginning of the week, that no way are we going to discuss that with the Russians. We'll talk about secondary issues. We'll talk about confidence building measures. We're talking about what forces may or may not be deployed and verification and things of this sort. But on the core demand that Moscow has about NATO expansion, Washington is saying absolutely not. It's not even up for discussion. And in the response, the Russians said that they essentially now have no choice but to resort to what they refer to as military technical measures to ensure their own security against the unwillingness of the West to address those security concerns. And we're waiting now to see, I think we're sort of in a way, kind of a Sitzkrieg, waiting to see what the next step is going to be from either side. And one of my concerns as this whole crisis has unfolded is the prospect that however much time the Russians take before they come back with their next measures, this leaves the door open to some kind of a provocation, some kind of a false flag, in eastern Ukraine, where it will be then claimed that Moscow has begun its assault on Ukraine, that there is now an invasion, the long predicted Russian invasion of Ukraine. In fact, I think too many neutral observers, or even some that are somewhat favorable toward Moscow, have been a little too quick to start chortling. Oh, well, look how they sort of got wrapped up in their own propaganda, predicting an invasion. Well, Wednesday's come and gone, the invasion hasn't happened. Let's wait and see what happens. I think we're going to see a little bit more ebb and flow between the two sides before something happens. But I think we're looking at the likelihood that something rather drastic will occur unless diplomacy really pulls a rabbit out of its hat here, which really means that the Western powers have to come off their high horse and address Moscow's concerns. They don't show any signs of doing that. I think in order to fully appreciate how we got to where we are today, we really have to go back, well, really to the time of the breakup of the Soviet Union and of the Warsaw Pact, and the assurances that Moscow was given that NATO would not expand further east. And of course, it's become very fashionable in the Western media and among Western experts to say no such assurances were given, or that the Russians did not ask for such assurance. And of course, there's plenty of material out there to show that such assurances were given, certainly in a way that the Russians took as a gentleman's agreement that this was not going to be done. In fact, let's remember at the time of the reunification of Germany, there was even the question of whether NATO would extend to the former East Germany within the new German borders. And that was a major concession on Moscow's part to say, yes, a united Germany would be fully within NATO, and there would be no question about that. When you make that concession, it's understood to start with that, yes, that's where it ends, and plus whatever other language was given to them at the time about further expansion. And we saw during the Clinton administration that Bill Clinton saw was going to be good politics in Illinois in particular, among the Polish community, to promise NATO expansion, because he was also afraid that Bob Dole, the Republican candidate, who was no less of a warmonger than anybody else in either party, was fully willing to play that card. So he decided to do it himself. So Czechia and Poland and Hungary were admitted to the alliance. It was at that point that I think we can say that any pretense that NATO had of being a defensive alliance ended. Let's remember the words of the former chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Dick Lugar of Indiana, that NATO had a choice to either go out of area or out of business. Now, the right choice would have been out of business, that the reason for NATO no longer existed. There was no longer a Soviet Union, no longer a Warsaw Pact, no real defensive need against anybody in the East, that the door was open for a reintegration of the European continent that had not existed since August of 1914, that the long war of 1914 to 1945 was finally over, the Cold War was finally over. We could get back into a Europe that was united and putting itself finally back onto the road of progress. That did not happen. What we saw instead was that people in Washington in both parties saw the opportunity for what amounts to global domination, to this kind of Trotskyite, quasi-Bolshevik mentality that we are the vanguard of all progressive humanity and that we will impose the one and only true doctrine, instead of peace, progress, and socialism, as the Soviet Union had as democracy, human rights, and free markets as we interpret them, and you're going to get it whether you like it or not. And that was the attitude that was dominant in Washington. And it really got its test run in the Balkans in the mid-1990s, partially in Bosnia, but more fully in Kosovo in 1999. That you might say that's when the NATO Death Star became fully operational. And of course, they never looked back. When we hear that NATO is a defensive alliance, we think not only of Kosovo, we think what happened in Libya, Iraq, which was not technically a NATO mission, but certainly was most of the same countries, and of course the countries that have been tearing Syria apart for the past few years. And then they wonder why nobody in Moscow takes seriously the protestations that, why don't you trust us? We're a defensive alliance. So this is where we are now. I think the question will be, what happens next in Ukraine? And how I have to believe that the Russians prepared for a rejection of their key demands when they issued them in the first place. They could have had no realistic sense that they would be met. The question would be, how far would the other side be willing to go to preserve their fading dominance in Europe? For several years now, we've been talking about the emergence of a new global order, of a multipolar world, where not only the United States and our allies, or satellites if you prefer, are the dominant force in the world, but Russia, China, the Eurasian powers, even other powers like India, Iran perhaps, are beginning to assert their own spheres in the world, and that these need to be respected. These are being, and perhaps this is most vividly illustrated in Eurasian immigration, the Belt and Road Initiative, something that has a perspective, the prospect of pulling together all of Eurasia in a very positive program of development that would include Europe as well. And I think in a sense, that is the real target here. And there was a piece written recently, I forget by whom, that the real issue here is not Ukraine, it's Germany. To make sure that Germany is not, and the rest of Europe by extension, with Germany's being the powerhouse of the European economy, that there is no integration of Europe and Germany into the broader Eurasian development scheme, and that anything that can be done to stop that, to basically trigger a new Cold War and division in Europe, not at an inter-German border, but at an inter-Ukraine border. If a war does occur there and Ukraine is carved up as a sacrificial lamb, that will basically limit how far Eurasian integration can get into Europe. And of course, we noticed how adamant that President Biden has been by saying that, yes, Nord Stream 2 will be shut down. And he states this unilaterally to the face of the German chancellor, as though it were the Americans' decision to shut down this project rather than Germany's or presumably Russia's. So I think we're waiting with bated breath right now. I think it's important for everybody to speak out about the prospect of war, how much that we have to be concerned that Western statements, yes, I'm not saying the Russians are blameless, but I think in comparison, the real problem is on the Western side, particularly in the United States and in the United Kingdom, who seem very eager to trip off a conflict in Ukraine because they believe that it will help exclude Russia from Europe and cause a new Cold War and force the Germans and the French, who have made signs of wanting to come to some accord with Moscow, to come back onto the American umbrella and never look back. We know when NATO was started, what was the catchphrase? Keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. In a way, that hasn't changed at all. And one way to ensure that, at least for another generation, would be to blow up Ukraine. And at least that's what some of these people in the West seem to think. That is the real danger here, in my opinion. I wish we had the transmissions belt, the means, the democratic means to force these people to come to account. We see the Republicans are piling on to Biden for not being warmongering enough. And that's really the coin of the realm in Washington these days. So let's hope for the best here. I hope the Russians have a plan to make their point politically and to show them the military realities in Europe without a whole lot of loss of life. But right now, it's anybody's guess what happens next.
That was James Jatras, diplomat, former advisor to the United States Senate Republican leadership. And we will have him and others. We will be going to questions, by the way. And if there are questions that you have, please submit them in writing. We will put it up on the screen. A few others will be available to answer as well. So our final presentation for this panel, and if you just joined us, by the way, the conference is 100 Seconds to Midnight on the Doomsday Clock. We need a new security architecture. Final person speaking is Shakil Ahmad Rameh of Pakistan. He's a political economist, and his topic is Imran Khan's proposal for Pakistan to mediate the relations between the U.S. and China.
Hello everybody, good morning, good evening and good afternoon everybody. So today I will be talking about the visit of Prime Minister Imran Khan to China. More specifically, I would be talking about the statement of Prime Minister Imran Khan about Pakistan, that Pakistan can mediate between USA and China. Before digging into how Pakistan will be mediating between China and USA, and second question, will it be possible this time to mediate between China and USA? Let's look at the history, because we have to look at the history because Pakistan is the only country which have the experience to mediate between China and USA in the 1970s. At that time, Pakistan was a formidable economic power. So world was recognizing Pakistan as an emerging country and emerging economy at that point of the time. That's been Pakistan has a consolidated position in the global arena. More importantly, Pakistan was a trusted friend of China and also a trusted friend of USA, because Pakistan was ally of so many alliances of USA. Number one. Number two, at that time, USA wanted to exploit the situation in its favor. In late 60s, there was several differences between between China and USSR. At that time, USA thought it would be good if they can use this incident or these events in their favor. So they wanted to create a rift between China and USSR. So they thought it is a good time to work with the China to create differences between USSR and China and make China an ally. So it would be good for them to isolate USSR at the global level. So they started the process to reconciliation with China, and for that purpose they requested Pakistan to come forward and mediate between two countries. Number three, there was another point, because at that time the difference between economic size of China and US was huge. This country did not have any comparison at that point of the time. And if we look at that, the economic status of USSR, that was also not very much comparable USA. So at that time, USA did not have any competition or cutting edge competition from any countries, including the USSR and China. So it was USA was thinking it would be good to forge a partnership and there would be no competition to USA in the long term. So in that context, Pakistan was asked to mediate between them. At that time, Pakistan has the confidence of USA and the confidence of China. So Pakistan started the process of the reconciliation between two countries, and Pakistan put efforts to mediate. And these mediations were successful. After that, China and USA started to work together. Now come to the present. The entire context has been entirely changed due to the different reasons. Number one, China is now formidable global economic power. China is moving very fast towards become the biggest economic power in the world. China is putting competition in front of USA in every field. If you talk about the economy, if you talk about the trade, if you talk about the cutting edge technologies, even simple technologies, China is moving very fast, especially in the artificial intelligence, quantum computing and in the 5G technology. China is way ahead from other competitors including the USA. So situation one count, the situation has been changed. Now USA has a competition in the field of economy and the technology. Second, they wanted to create a chaos in the region by using the Russia. But at this point of the time, Russia and China, they are working very closely. So there is no chance to create the rift between these two countries. In the past, in the 60s and 90s, in late 60s, there was a rift between two countries, and that gives a chance USA to exploit that situation. But now both countries are working very closely. There is no chance that the USA or their allies can create any rift between these two countries. Number three, USSR has also re-emerged at the global stage as a big economic power. They are fast moving on the global ladder. After their turmoil, after their disintegration, they are recovering very fast, and they have the support of regional countries, especially from the China. So the whole context has been changed. In this context, Pakistani situation has been also changed. Now, at that time, Pakistan was a good economic power. It was the emerging economic power. Right now, Pakistan has been entangled in different issues, including the debt trap by IMF, World Bank, other and international financial institutions. Economic indicators are very weak. Pakistan is looking to enhance the growth and the sustainable development in the Pakistan. Pakistan is looking toward the international cooperation to revive its economy. And Pakistan is part of the CPEC, which is a major corridor of the BRI. So then the whole context has been changed. In this context, will Pakistan be able to mediate? We have to look into deeply. Number one, China, they are friends. Pakistan and China, they are iron brother. They trust each other. But now the problem is US say that they are deadly against China. And they are pressuring Pakistan to come out of BRI and CPEC. If Pakistan come out of CPEC and BRI, so there would be differences, the rift between two countries, China and Pakistan, then how Pakistan will be able to mediate between two countries? And if Pakistan is not coming out, that definitely Pakistan will not come out of CPEC and the BRI, and Pakistan will not compromise on our Aryan brotherhood with China. So then how will the US will accept it? They will not accept it. So both parties, they have on their differences. I think in this context, it would be difficult Pakistan to mediate between two countries, especially when the USA is not ready to compromise on its demands, including to come out of the CPEC and the BRI, and it's a competition. Not I will say that no, it's become the conflict with the China, because the trade conflict has been given the new heights during the Biden administration. So in this context, it has become very difficult Pakistan to mediate between two countries. But there are some chances. The chance emerges from Belt and Road Initiative, because Belt and Road Initiative is an economic opportunity for the whole world. It is open for every country. No more than the 140 countries and the other global institutions, they have signed the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. The most recent one is Argentina. So it is a global initiative which have everything, which have something to offer to every country. Even the World Bank report, they have mentioned if the BRI has been implemented successfully till 2030, so the initial parts of BRI, so there will be the gain of 1.6 trillion US dollar in the social welfare of the people. That is a huge gain. If the whole project has been completed in the coming year, then you can imagine how much will be the benefit of this project. And these are the benefits which are open for everybody, and US can also benefit from there if the US become the part of it. This is an open secret now. US economy is facing problem. US debt is increasing. They don't have the money to spend on the people. It is apparent from during the COVID-19 episode, they have to print the money. They did not have the resources, they have to print the money, which have the global implication for the world. So if they want to reverse this situation, they need new economic opportunities, and new economic opportunity, the best avenue available at this point of the time is Belt and Road Initiative, because it's a global in nature, it is open, it is equality based, and it offers benefit to everybody. There is no terms and conditions that you have to follow to become part of the BRI. There's only one condition: you need to be the welcoming to every type of economic integration in the world. So USA can benefit. Unfortunately, USA think it is only the Chinese initiative and only Chinese will benefit from it. No, it's not true. It is open for everybody. That's why, but nobody can convince USA till to the point. So it is open for everybody. It is not about the China, it is about the world. So they have proposed their own initiatives, like the Build Back Better program. They have also coming up with other programs. So in this context, I think it will become more difficult to benefit from the BRI opportunities, which are very open for everybody. So US have to rethink, and if the US rethink about its strategy to counter the BRI, to not counter the BRI, they have to become the part of BRI. Then Pakistan will be a better position to mediate between two countries, because on the earth, Pakistan is the only country which have the experience to mediate between China and USA. Thank you.
All right, and we want to thank everyone for being with us up to this point. We've now concluded all of the speakers for today, and we're going to now go to questions and answers. and we should bring up on the screen. I see that Helga Sepp-LaRouche, the founder of the Schiller Institute, is with us. Harley Schlanger is there. I'm seeing Mr. Nielsen is there. Colonel Corvez is there from France. That's good. And is Shaquille with us? Yes, he is. Very good. All right. So let me first ask Helga if she would have anything to say in reflection to what she's heard so far, or otherwise has anything else to say to us today in this morning's panel.
Well, first of all, I want to thank all the speakers for having contributed extremely valuable ideas. And I think we should discuss, how to make sure that we reach an ever larger group of people internationally, because I think the converging view was that it's an extremely dangerous moment, and it is not yet clear what is the outcome of this historical moment. I would like to just comment on the speech of Natalia, which, it's always shocking to hear her. And I think that is not part of the equation. I mean, the fact is that the West completely backed up a coup in 2014, which brought in many elements of a Nazi tradition. And that was known to all the countries in the West. I'm saying that because, the Western intelligence services supported these Nazi elements in the entire post-war period. It was sort of a Gladio operation against the Soviet Union. And I think this is a big scandal because it's always mentioned Putin is the aggressor in Crimea. He's the only one who changed the borders of Europe in the post-war period with violence. But it is always omitted that the West did support a fascist coup. And, I think that if that is not discussed, then the whole picture, the whole narrative is completely wrong. So I would hope that, Natalia's speech in particular would find the widest circulation, because if you want to get the narrative really straight, then that is an absolutely crucial element.
Right. Let me simply say that probably the best thing would be to see if there's anyone from the panel that we have that's live with us who has any comment they'd like to make, and then we will go directly to questions. We have several questions, and I guess we're going to flash again on the screen as to how you have questions. We may also be joined on the line by one or two others that are there. I think that Bill Binney is with us, I believe, and I think Kirk Wiebe may be with us as well. But let me simply first ask, okay, Harley?
Yeah, I think one of the things that came through clearly in virtually every presentation, although it wasn't always named this, is that the problem is geopolitics. And this is something that Helga has been emphasizing, that unless you get rid of a worldview shaped by geopolitics, you'll never escape war, exploitation, and depression. And it's important to realize this because what's the crime of Russia and China? It has nothing to do with what Russia is doing in Ukraine. It has to do what they're doing with Eurasian integration. And the fact that an integrated Eurasian economic space is very attractive to most European countries, in particular France, Germany, Italy, and others. Now, this has been the basis for an Anglo-American imperial policy back before it was Anglo-American, when it was just British, with the beginning of geopolitics at the end of the 19th century, which was the British Empire was threatened by such things as the Trans-Siberian Railroad, Berlin to Baghdad Railroad, and so on. And so the doctrine basically says you must at all costs prevent unity in Europe and a possibility of a European orientation toward Eurasia. That hasn't changed. What changed was when the United States, after World War II, was brought in, especially after the Kennedy assassination, to the geopolitical doctrine. And I think this is where we have to wage our fight today. I think Shaquille was very much on point when he said that the Belt and Road Initiative represents a way out. a collaboration among nations for economic development, including for the United States, which has been badly damaged by the economic policies of the post-Cold War period. So I think virtually everyone was talking about this. I just wanted to make it explicit that as long as the American policy, Republicans, Democrats, military, think tanks, academia, media, and so on, is shaped by this Anglo-American or British geopolitical doctrine, which benefits the world's leading speculators and looters, there's no way out. The advantage we have now is that that system is collapsing, the economic system, and we see the weaknesses in the so-called unity of the West for a war with Russia. So we have an opportunity now, but we have to go at the core of the problem, which is this geopolitical doctrine, which turns nations against each other.
Give you a chance because I had to cut your speech a bit for time. If you have anything that you wanted to add at this point or any reaction to what you've heard so far. Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. I think a very small.
Excuse me. I was asking Mr. Nielsen, and he had put his hand up. So just let me see. Did you have something that you wanted to say? Please.
Just a few. Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's a little. Hold on, we're going to work on your volume. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, you can hear me.
Yes,
it's important, of course. Yes. Okay. I would say that the panel here, we have a lot of work before us, because I can say for my own country in the parliament, we just had a discussion about Ukraine, about sending soldiers, things to Estonia. And I think it was almost all in the parliament who agreed that Russia is an aggressor and things like that. When I talk to Russian people, I'm very often in Russia and I speak Russian. They are very surprised, because why is it that Europeans, they submit to the Americans, accept that the Americans can decide that Europe should not work with Russia? And if you look at from another planet and you from the outside, it seems very, very strange that Europeans like that submit to the American wishes. I think it was Jatras. He mentioned that Biden, he said that Nord Stream 2 will close at the face of Scholz, the German chancellor, and I think that I'm a little puzzled, because I think it's very, very obvious that Europe has their own interest towards Russia, in cooperation with Russia. So I think it's very difficult to convince, because I also very often talk to Danish politicians, and they are very emotionally engaged, and the media and academically, I think most of it, the vast part of it, is very much against this, engaged in this Russophobia. So there's a task ahead of us.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, very good. So, Mr. Rame, go ahead.
Thank you. I have a very small intervention. I think we also need to talk about the corporate greed, because the real problem at this point of the time, the nexus of this industrial and the military complex, and how the corporate sector is greedy to capture the resources of different countries, and maybe there is something to talk about. So how the corporate can be pinpoint and pressurized to alter their ways. Thank you.
Okay. Now, we've gotten various questions, and everyone is not on. That is, we've gotten questions from Mr. Jatras, who will be joining us for the second panel, and also for Natalia Vitrenko. Let me just say, we will make sure that those questions are asked, and again, Mr. Jatras will be with us in the afternoon panel. He's not able to be with us this morning. So this is a question to the panel from Renee. Thanks to Jim for bringing into the discussion the motivation to stop Germany from linking into Eurasian development. Is it not the case that the coup in Ukraine, which built up momentum starting in 2013, but really got going in 2014, was substantially also a reaction to China's announcement of the Belt and Road Initiative through Xi Jinping's speech in Kazakhstan? The preparations for the coup in Ukraine originated much earlier, but the fuse was lit at that time. Can you comment? So I think that's probably directed first to you, Helga, and then any others that have something that they'd like to say.
Well, the time is a coincidence, but I think that the definition of Russia and China as enemies, this was about the period when that became much more into focus. But I think that, from my perspective, I was watching the Belt and Road development after Xi Jinping had announced it. And I was actually quite surprised that for about 4 years, the Western media, the Western think tanks and politicians almost ignored the Belt and Road Initiative, despite the fact that it was clear at that time that it would become the greatest infrastructure project in history ever. And I think it was just a real surprise and an underestimate of what it would become. So I'm not quite sure. Maybe some other people have some other insights, but I think it was not exactly a reaction to that.
Okay. Any other comments on the question? Okay. I'm going to go to the next question here. Now, this one is from Argentina. This is a question. What is the situation of Ukrainian public opinion? Is there any organized resistance by the more progressive sectors of society to the deliberate driving of the country into this dramatic situation? Now, that was primarily directed toward Natalia Vitrenko. We can ask her for an answer, but is there anybody else on the panel that would like to speak to that? Okay, both Mr. Nielsen and Helga. So, Mr. Nielsen, why don't you go first, and then we'll go to Helga.
Yeah, well, as Natalia Vitrenko mentioned, of course, it's well known here that the government in Ukraine, they shut down Russian television channels, and they put this Viktor Medvedchuk in arrest and things like that. So I don't. It's not at all. It's very, very far from a democracy in Ukraine, and so of course I know that, like Natalia Vitrenko, and there are also some other groups as working against, but it's very difficult because I would not to call it a fascist regime is a little, put it very strong, but I think it's a very, very authoritarian. It's certainly not a democracy, and there's no real free speech, and you could be punished just if you are in favor of the Minsk II accord, and you can be punished if you say something about Bandera, that he is not a hero and things like that. So of course I think there are under the surface there are a widespread anger against the government, and they're certainly not satisfied. I have talked with several Ukrainians working in Denmark and Poland and other countries, and they are very, very dissatisfied. They're very frustrated because Ukraine is an extreme poor country, and Ukraine should be, according to the level of education, it's a black earth area, and they have all the premises for becoming a very flourishing, rich country, but it is not at all. So, of course, there are some internal, there are really dissatisfied people everywhere in Ukraine. Thank you.
Okay, yes, Helga?
Well, there was recently a survey whereby a lot of people had turned into an anti-Russian view, which is surprising because at the time when the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact disintegrated, I mean, the mood was completely different, and the overwhelming majority of the population was for the formation of a new entity to be created with Russia. But if you look at the incredible bombardment of propaganda which went into the situation, Victoria Nuland admitted in 2013-14 that the State Department alone had spent $5 billion on NGOs. And what did these NGOs say? They said, join the EU, join NATO, then you will have immediately a living standard like Germany. You will have lots of time for vacation, like in France. And so the population, a lot of the ordinary people who went on the Maidan end of 2013, beginning of 2014, in the preparatory period of the coup, a lot of people were, simple people who just hoped for a better life, because, the poverty was and unfortunately is tremendously big. And, in a certain sense, these people were deluded. And, now that after Yushchenko was president, he started this very conscious anti-Russian propaganda. So I think there was an incredible social engineering in the population in Ukraine, and that's why the sentiment has really shifted. But groups like the Progressive Socialist Party of Natalia Vitrenko, they are fighting a heroic fight despite an incredibly difficult situation. But I think that the Nazi element is an integral part. Jarosz, who was the head of the right sector, is now an advisor, a military advisor, and the role of the British should not be underestimated. The former General Messenger is now also an advisor to the military, advising the Ukrainian army on military reforms and things like that. So there is a lot of stirring the pot, and the victim of all of that is the Ukrainian population.
Okay, Harley, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that Natalia, when she ran for president, got 11% of the vote. And it's clear that what's happened, what Helga just described, is key. But I put the burden on this on the West, the Western media, which created the myth of the democratic revolution in Ukraine and the idea that the Ukrainian population was anti-Russian, when in fact it was a coup that was orchestrated according to a book on color revolution, which is the regime change model that the British developed and the Americans worked on in Ukraine. And if you look at this, you see the complete blackout in the Western media of the important role of the neo-Nazi militia in the Maidan coup in February 2014. And there's still presence today in possibly the threat to assassinate Zelensky, were he to break with this policy. So I think this is our job is to make sure that people in the West know that we're dealing with an example of the most hideous form of what happened after the end of World War II with the Dulles brothers and others, working with Nazi organizations to impose anti-Russian policies.
Okay, and Shaquille, I think you had your hand up as well.
Yes. So I think when we talk here in Pakistan or some with our friends, so one of the things we are talking here, so is that the Americans and their allies, they have trying to create chaos in Afghanistan. So on the one border of the China, and the other side, they are trying to create a chaos in the Central Asia and the Eastern Europe part. So on the other side of the China and the corridors. So actually we have to look at this also the perspective, why they think they cannot compete China. They cannot isolate China. So best available chance is to create chaos around the China or around the corridor, BRI corridors. Why they think they cannot isolate China? Because as if we compare with Russia with the China, at that time, Russia was not that much connected or interconnected in the global system. China is highly interconnected in the system. So it would be very difficult to disengage world from the China. So they are trying to create the chaos. That is another perspective.
Okay. So we have a couple of things to say. We have a question that helps, and we have a couple of people who are with us today, which who would like to respond. And I'm going to ask the question first to the panel, and then we're going to bring up Bill Binney, who we will introduce at that time for people that don't happen to know who he is. So the question is from Adam, and it said, excuse me, my iPad went down for a minute, just a minute. How can we overcome the Western mainstream media, which is influencing American and European public opinion to have a very negative view, both of Russia and Vladimir Putin, so on, to the point of war. What can we do? So that's the question. So does anybody on the panel want to answer that? If not...
Can you repeat the question?
Okay. How can we overcome the Western mainstream media, which is influencing the American and European public opinion to have a negative view of Russia and Vladimir Putin to the point of war? So Harley had his hand up.
Well, Helga, why don't you go ahead, Helga?
Oh.
Well, I think, once you recognize that you're really living in an occupied territory, which is controlled by what Ray McGovern calls the Mickey-Med, the military-industrial congressional media think tank complex, and that is not very different in Europe. For example, in Germany, the pro-NATO forces in all of these institutions. The British had an institution a while ago called the Integrity Initiative, which was the idea that in all these institutions, parliament, media, think tanks, they would have what they call cluster agents, which is like, you may have a totally normal newspaper, but then you stick in 1 or 2 or 3 journalists to make sure that the pro-NATO line is being kept at all costs. And you can actually, after a while, when you watch TV, you can actually identify who are these cluster agents, because they always, immediately come out with the official line. Now, once you recognize that that is the problem, and that means naturally that the so-called democracy of the Western liberal system is maybe not so democratic at all, then you are left only with the choice to develop what they call in German civil courage, Zivilcourage. And I think that is a question which really needs some, courage, because most people, when they realize that the official opinion is in such a way, then they don't stick their neck out. They don't want to be heard to say something different. They want to go along to get along. And that is how actually the democracy turns into a dictatorship. But if people, basically say, I have to fight for the truth, then, and you speak out and you speak of your opinion, then you can change it and you can help to change the environment. I think, from my perspective, and I think I know both Russia and China maybe a little bit more than the average person. I'm not calling myself an expert, but I have enough experience to have an own judgment about the character of the people, about the policies of the leadership, their general intention. And I can assure you that from my perspective, neither Russia nor China are anything like what they're being characterized in the press. As a matter of fact, it's almost like the Western media, they have a convex spectacle. I maybe mix it now with a concave. In any case, they are saying everything about Russia and China, what they are doing themselves. So it's almost mirror exchanged. And once you take that into account, then all the beautiful virtues which are attributed to the West are actually really represented for the most part by Russia and China. China in particular has done an enormous amount for human rights by lifting 850 million people out of poverty, by reaching out to the developing countries, offering them for the first time ever to overcome poverty and underdevelopment. So, I think it's really upside down and you have to fight for it. Use your friends and relatives and acquaintances to set the record straight and join us, because, if you cannot do it on your own, you can be extremely efficient when you join an organization which is fighting for the truth. And that is the one thing I claim for the Schiller Institute.
Yeah, and Harley, you had your hand up before, correct?
Yeah, well, Helga said pretty much what I wanted to say, except I'll add one point. The media in the United States has no credibility, and their ratings are collapsing. There's a vacuum created because of that, and our job is to use the ironies that demonstrate not just that it's fraudulent, but that, for example, that when they say the West is democratic and China and Russia are authoritarian, what about the case of Assange? What about the case of Lyndon LaRouche? Those treatments show that this is not a democracy in the West. When you attack Russia for censoring, what about the social media censorship in the United States? So I think all the objective circumstances are there, including the loss of credibility for the media. What's not there is what Helga was just talking about, the courage to go out and take on the passivity or the indifference to the effects of policies that are being carried out in the names of Americans. And I think we have to get under people's skin on that. And I hear so often from people who say they're too powerful, they're in control completely. They're not in control. The financial system is set to blow. We're on the verge of World War III because the geniuses running the unipolar world have no policy except provocation and war. So their powers are ebbing. And it's a moment of time where courage is the biggest lack on our side, and people should just get off their rear ends and get out and do something. And joining us is the best way to start.
Okay, I just want to let a couple people know that Colonel Corvez, we're going to have a question for you in a minute when we come back. And we have also Harley, we have one for you. But now what we're going to do is bring up Bill Binney, who I want to introduce. Bill Binney was the former technical director of the World Geopolitical and Military Analysis and Reporting Section of the National Security Agency, where he worked for 30 years until he resigned after the catastrophic intelligence failure of 9/11. He was once asked by a Danish journalist who was covering a story about how their defense intelligence had been giving massive amounts of raw material to the NSA. He said, "This is exactly the problem that I saw, that NSA, CIA, FBI, and Bush started with Bush, Cheney, Hayden, and former CIA Chief George Tenet. They set the process up in 2001, and then they extended it to various other countries in the world, including the Five Eyes, US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand." So he is a person who, when he speaks about things involving the topic that just got raised to us, probably knows what he's talking about. So, Bill, go right ahead with whatever comments you want to make or any questions you have.
Well, thanks. And it's good to be with you.
Hold on. We want to get your volume up.
Okay.
Give us a minute. Okay. Okay, try now.
Okay, well, thank you, and thanks. I'm glad to be with you. To me, I see this entire issue as promoted or starting with two fundamental issues. One is the NATO, US, and other military alliances and the need to justify in the United States an $800 billion a year budget for the military-industrial Mickey Mac complex that Ray McGovern calls. So they have a very large budget here to justify, and so does NATO. They've got all these military alliances around the world, and so they have to justify this. Now, in order to do that, they have to have some potential enemy. Well, the only enemy that has enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world and help, or has more than we do, really, is Russia. And so that's the primary one. And they have that based on the old Soviet Union, the hatred and fear of the Soviet Union that has evolved over decades after World War II. And so that's a prime candidate to be our potential enemy. Now, when they first started talking about bringing Ukraine into NATO, I was here in the United States saying, well, if you're going to do that with Ukraine, why don't you also ask Russia into NATO? That way, we're all part of the same thing. But the objective was to have a potential enemy so they could justify huge budgets. So that's the one of the main reasons that's behind this. It's all this money, military, industrial, intelligence complex. It's like our secret government, so to speak. And the second major reason that I see is a historical one. If you look back through history, all regimes, when they're in trouble internally in their own countries, they tend to look outside to say there's a threat out there. We have this threat to get people, I call it the Wizard of Oz game. Don't pay any attention to the man behind the curtain. Look over there. So the whole idea is to focus attention away from what's happening internally in the United States, away to what's happening in Ukraine, so that people get more concerned about that. Now, Biden said he doesn't want to get a shooting war with Russia. And I know he doesn't, because what he wants to do is divert attention away from all the major problems his regime has here in the United States. And they are major, not just things on the southern border or crime or the economy especially. And the supply chain, all of that, all these major problems internally in the United States that in 1 year have been problems. Before that, they weren't. Now they are. Now those are going to be really big for the upcoming election in November. And so they have to divert attention away from that so that the people here, before they vote, won't be paying attention to the real problems. Well, they're going to have a hard time doing that because the economy is really hitting them hard. So, but their idea is to divert attention away to this external threat so that they can get past this upcoming election and still stay in power. And so I figure my thought is that the regime here in the U.S. is going to keep this problem going to at least November of this year. And they're not going to get in a shooting war.
Okay, anybody want to respond to what Bill had to say? Let me just ask that of the panel. Okay, so we'll leave that there and percolating, which thank you very much for that, Bill. We're going to go to a question right now for Colonel Corvez. And the question was, can Colonel Corvez speak about the role that the French and President Macron are taking to try to diffuse the situation in Ukraine? Can you unmute? We need you may be muted.
Okay.
Yes.
That's okay?
Yeah, you're
okay. Yes. You know, President Macron went to Moscow to meet President Putin. But actually, before the meeting already, President Putin knew that he was receiving a French president who was part of NATO. And he was actually the Missi Dominici of President Biden of the United States, because President Biden is just in front, but it's behind him that the deep state is ruling the United States. And then, as he is, for the moment, for 6 months, president of European Union, he thought he could do something and to try to solve this crisis. But he cannot solve this crisis discussing with President Putin if he is still a first member, premium member of NATO, because he has been received by President Putin as a president who is the representative of NATO and of the United States. That's why he was not in a position to be effective in his mediation. That's the difference between him and the way that President Putin received 3 days later or 4 days later, I don't remember exactly, President Bolsonaro from Brazil. You can see from the beginning of the arrival of the difference between the arrival of President Macron and of President Bolsonaro. Everything was different because President Putin was thinking receiving the president of Brazil as an independent president and not Missi Dominici of the United States policy. But when he was receiving President Macron, he was receiving a representative of the United States policy. That's why we in France, many people in France are working to say that we have to come back to our sovereignty and our independence, to be a country which will be able to make a bridge between Russia and the Western Europe. That's the only way to promote a peace solution in this crisis. You know, this crisis is the reverse crisis of Cuba between Khrushchev and Kennedy in 1962. It's exactly the opposite position, because Kennedy said to Khrushchev, I cannot accept your nuclear warhead so close to my border. And then I shall go to the war, nuclear war with you, if you don't take off your missiles. President Putin asked the same thing to NATO. You have your warhead on our border. This is not acceptable, and this cannot go on like this if we want a world to have a world with peaceful relations between the different countries. Then to come back to this mission of President Macron to Moscow, maybe it was a good idea to go there and to try to find a solution, but it was not possible to find a solution with Russia when you come to say, I am in the camp in the side of United States. He had to offer a new position, saying, we understand your exigence, we understand that you need a security for your country, and we are going to discuss with you what we can do. You know, Ukraine is a poor country, which is the ground for this dispute between the Western Bloc and Russia. But instead of the many declarations of President Putin and of the government of Russia saying that we are not going to invade Ukraine, the propaganda said the contrary every time, because they don't want to come to the solution to take off their warheads near Russia. And I think the only solution, as a nuclear war, is not possible. Until now, the United States have imposed their views to many countries in the world, starting from Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and others, because these countries have no nuclear warhead to say, I don't agree with you. But look with North Korea. This is a small country, but now they have the nuclear warhead and said to the United States, you cannot attack us, because if you attack us, you will receive our nuclear warheads also. Then I think that we have to understand that the United States cannot wage a war against Russia, because it would be the apocalypse, the end of the world. Then they have to use other countries to try to reach their objectives. And Ukraine is the poor country that since 2014 and even before is used by United States policy to threaten Russia. Then when Macron went to see Putin in Moscow, the result was sure that he would not come with a solution, because it was impossible to have a solution when you stay in a camp, in a side, and that you don't accept the exigence of the other side.
All right, very good. So now we have a question for Harley. This question is this. In your keynote, you summarized the circumstances we are currently facing today in Ukraine. Yesterday, it was reported that over 700,000 civilians from the Donbass region were evacuated by Russia. While the mainstream media is presenting this as a, quote, false flag, it is clear that they are attempting to provoke a conflict in this region to make it appear that Russia is conducting a full-on invasion of Ukraine. But your approach is unique in the fact that you mentioned the ongoing economic crisis in Ukraine and the crisis in the transatlantic financial system generally. Why is this a critical thing to understand in respect to the strategic crisis?
Well, let me go back to something that we've discussed a little bit, this idea of MICMAT, the Military, Industrial, Congressional, Intelligence, Media, Academic Think Tank approach. What we're really talking about with that is a conglomerate or a blob of corporate cartels. And these are, what we're seeing is corporations that are in debt, that have been trading financial instruments of no underlying value back and forth and getting funds from the Federal Reserve or from other central banks to back them up so they can keep these financial assets on their books at face value. This has collapsed. It's gone. Since September 2019, trillions of dollars have been expended in overnight loans that then turn into indefinite loans to keep the system afloat. Now, one of the interesting aspects of Ukraine is that after the Maidan revolution, or coup, what happened? The new government brought in the International Monetary Fund that imposed a shock therapy policy on Ukraine, which loaded up debt on a country at the same point that it had lost much of its industrial capability, large part of which is in eastern Ukraine. Ukraine needs $4 to $5 billion to avoid a default. Now, if you look at that on the surface, that's not a lot, given that there are trillions of dollars outstanding. But it reflects the fundamental weakness of the transatlantic financial system. And this is the corporate conglomerates that fund the academics, the media, the think tanks that churn out the narratives that we get shoved down our throats every night when we hear from the Blinkens, the Jake Sullivans, the NBC, MSNBC, CNN media. And this is, it's not objective journalism. It's an intent to sustain a narrative which keeps people helpless in the face of a crisis where they're trying to move to a whole new system. They don't want a security guarantee for Russia. They want the continued confrontation, partly because of what Bill Binney said, because they're trying to justify a huge defense budget, but also because they're trying to justify keeping a bankrupt system afloat. What Lyndon LaRouche said has to be done is the system has to be put through complete bankruptcy reorganization. Many of these zombie corporations who don't make enough money to pay the interest on their debt should either be shut down with the cancellation of that debt or should be reorganized so that they can eat some of their losses, have the speculators eat the losses, but then ensure that there's credit for physical production. That can only occur if this MICMAT is defeated. So I think the reason that I focus so much, and we at the Schiller Institute on the financial side of things, is you can't separate the strategic policy from this financial morass that they're in. And it's not that if Ukraine defaults, that blows out the system. Virtually any default could blow out the system. And if they try to prevent defaults by pumping in more money, they're just increasing the inflation. So they're at an end. And they would prefer to use a confrontation as the basis of forcing through these changes that they want toward a great reset than to accept the idea that they have to go through bankruptcy reorganization. Bankruptcy reorganization, the LaRouche's 4 laws, should be the program that all patriots of all nations support because those are coherent with the idea of sovereign nation states acting for the common good.
Okay. We have with us now Kirk Wiebe, the member of the Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity and a former senior analyst with the National Security Agency. He's also a partner in the prevention of crimes of the intelligence community with Bill Binney, and he's got something he'd like to say. So can we bring Kirk up?
Hello, can you hear me?
I think we're all right. Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
All right. Well, let me first say good afternoon, good evening to the panel members and the audience. And thank you to the Schiller Institute for hosting this wonderful discussion. How timely it is. You know, as I'm listening to all of you comment and respond to the questions, I have been busy taking notes because the discussion has been absolutely relevant and spot on. And I guess if I could sum up what I'm hearing, we are in an environment of conflict versus cooperation. And it's because of the reasons that Harley and that Bill Binney mentioned. Money. We are corrupt. The key players in this whole discussion, not within Schiller, but the key global players are largely corrupt. And money is the driver behind the financial system, behind the corporations that are not allowed to fail, behind the rigid stance of a Biden administration on NATO. We need to create conflict so that money can be spent and those in the elite, the ruling elite, can get a paycheck. The Colonel, Mr. Yatras, and again, Harley have been spot on. We no longer need NATO. It's absolutely clear. And the Colonel brought up the example of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We would not allow a Soviet interest close to our border. Well, my goodness, should it be surprising that Mr. Putin does not want any more influence up against his border? It's a perfectly understandable situation from the standpoint of the Russians, and until the US and the West starts conducting business in a spirit of cooperation and getting away from this money-making notion that we have to have conflict, we cannot make forward progress. And imagine the effect that has on the LaRouche organizations, Helga's vision for assisting the poorer countries of the world. We are wasting huge sums of money on corruption. And I include in that a false premise that we must maintain NATO because of a Russian threat. And that's where I see things right now. Thank you.
Sure, very good. Anyone have anything to say in response to Mr. Wiebe? Yeah, Shaquille. Please go ahead.
Yes. I think I can also correlate one or two examples from Pakistan. So Pakistan was pressurized on economic terms to leave the BRI, but Pakistan sustained the pressure. What they did, they took Pakistan to FATF. If you look at the compliance list of the Pakistan, that is more perfect than the US and many other developed countries. But still Pakistan is a gray list. So they are trying to punish Pakistan economically, then they can come forward for the other thing. And second thing, money is so important, but they also want to, you can say, create hindrance in other countries if they're moving on a development ladder. For example, what is happening in Afghanistan? I think in Afghanistan, the same attention is also required because the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan will have the spillover effect on other regional countries. But that is happening right now. And Mr. Biden, God forbid, and God save this word, and he has taken out the half of money of Afghan people from that money. So on the freeze accounts. So we also need the same attention on the Afghanistan, because that is happening right now. We also need to avert the human crisis in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Anyone else? Okay, Kirk, we're gonna leave that in there. I'm sure you're gonna get some other responses as we go along, but thank you for that. And I'm going to go to another question. This is from Anastasia. She's asking, regarding what Benny had brought up, I realize that the Ukraine crisis is a false flag operation and a made-up story, but it seems to me that to be more an issue to destabilize Russia and China rather than only an American cover-up. Problem I see is that if people don't take the build-up for war seriously, then we would end up in one. What are your thoughts? So that is her question. Anybody want to take that up? We'll leave that as a thought object. There was a person, I don't have this person's name here, excuse me. I'm going to try to get this. There's a question concerning Nord Stream 2, and I wanted to see if I can find that, but maybe I will. Oh, yeah, here it is. I think Lyndon LaRouche said this is from Venezuela. I think Lyndon LaRouche said many times that the present crisis is the result of people having bad ideas, common ideas that reflect a culture of hedonism, wrong concept of mankind, and a wrong concept in general. Well, in respect to the present strategic crisis, I had a discussion with a friend on the Nord Stream 2 question. He said that it is, quote, normal to expect that Ukraine tries to block the Nord Stream 2 in order to not get negatively affected by the project. What kind of thinking does that reflect? Is this the kind of thinking that Lyndon LaRouche was referring to earlier when he discussed how ideas shape the present crisis? And do you think it's possible to have a new international security architecture that ensures security and stability and the development of everyone if this kind of thinking remains in the international arena? So who would like to answer that? I think that's going to fall to you, Helga.
I think that the Ukrainians naturally would like to have all the revenues from any energy transported from Russia into Western Europe for themselves. But, I think they are also as much manipulated. The question of Nord Stream 2, which not only affects Germany, but altogether 12 European countries, in a certain sense, has become the synonym for sovereignty. And, you can actually see all the people who are yelling and screaming, Nord Stream 2 must be closed down. These are the people in the NATO faction and the people who have the guts to say that, as Chancellor Scholz did in the beginning, now he's wavering a little bit, saying that Nord Stream 2 he said it's a perfectly private business question and therefore should not be subject to these state-related sanctions. I think it's a question of sovereignty. And, for me, this question of fighting for sovereignty is really a key, because if countries, or leaderships of countries rather, accept to be deprived of their sovereignty, then they have absolutely no say. And, the people then say, oh, there's nothing one can do. And that is a sentence which I think is the most devastating sentence, because, that sentence, I said in the past, should be put under punishment. And people who say there's nothing I can do about it should go into the dungeon for 10 years. And if that would make the round, people would stop saying it, because that is what turns people into underlings. So I think the Nord Stream 2 question is really the question, can the Europeans fight for their sovereignty, or are there underlings and slaves?
I'm going to begin to combine a few questions. Does anybody else have a response to that? because of time and also because of subject matter. So this is a question from Haiti, which is, what role has the United States played in the unipolar world, and how would it participate in a multipolar order? And how can we get the United States to accept that sort of idea? That's basically the question. There's another question which was similar, which was from Chad, actually. What are the strategies to advance to redefine a multipolar world? So that's a very similar question. And I think I'll just take those two right now. Again, there are some questions for Mr. Jatras and Ms. Natalia Vitrenko. We will forward those to Mr. Jatras for the second panel. So anybody want to respond on this question of unipolar, multipolar world? Okay, well, Kirk, hold for a minute. We're going to go to the Shaquille first. And Kirk is there. He'd like to say something, I see. And just let's go ahead, Shaquille.
Yeah, I think the best available solution is that if the system can offer something for the greed of the corporate. And that is not possible, because the new economic system which we are talking about, that is mostly about the society base, where everybody can get some benefit, not the few elite people on the system, they can get the benefit. So until unless the role of elite corporate sector is not eliminated, or you can say the minimized, so there is I think there's the chance of the conflict. That is simple.
And Mr. Wiebe apparently had something. Well, let's see if he, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to mention that if we think about it, what brings nations together more than anything else, and it has been true historically, has been economics. We must cultivate economic vigor. We talk about multipolar world. Well, what are we saying? We're talking about a world where the majority, the huge majority, and I mean 90+% parts of the world can participate. That's all we're talking about. And the more we focus on the economics and the strategies and the processes that engender healthy, strong economic exchanges among and across nations, the sooner we will achieve a legitimate, justifiable balance in a multipolar world. At least I think so.
Okay, so I think we have now, here's what we're going to do, unless there's any other person that wants to say anything. All right, so what we're going to do, Mr. Nielsen, go ahead.
Yeah, just a short remark, because I wanted to say, if you look at history, empires do not last very long. We can see in history there's been many empires, but they also broke up, all of them. And the basic question is, how do they end up? Some will do it peacefully. I'm happy to live a country, Denmark. We used to be an empire, but we are not anymore. I think it's a good thing. And also, I think that Soviet Union also broke up with the British and French Empire. It was quite difficult. There was a lot of wars in it. And I think very basic question, how will the United States, how will this empire dissolve? Hopefully it will be peacefully, but I'm not quite sure it will be. So I think it's a very, very basic question, how it will be, because we know that empires, to uphold the empire, they have to use more and more money. So I think it's a very, very crucial question, how the Americans will react to the fact that they will be just a kind of nation in the future in a multipolar world, because the multipolar world is coming, whatever Americans would like it or not.
We have all right, if you don't, we have another person that has a brief remark. This is Major General Carol Childers, 44 years in the United States Army National Guard, retired in 1999, and I think he had a comment and question. Are you there, sir? Yes, you are there. Let's see if we can hear you.
Good morning. Am I coming through?
Yes.
Thank you. I'm been sitting off on the side here listening and enjoying the discussion quite a lot. I was also watched the one last night, and last night I had by chance been reading a list that a friend of mine sent me, and it talked about the list talked about all of the great mineral wealth that Ukraine has, and it just occurred to me that well, that's the kind of reason people look for to go to war. And one of the speakers here mentioned the importance of economics to the world, and how the world gets along based on the economic exchanges that they're able to work out. And then you look at, well, there's the tonnage count of minerals in the ground in some countries, and then there's the tonnage count of how much military power that certain countries have. Certainly, we don't want to go to a nuclear war situation, even over vast mineral quantities that might be available as a result of the outcome of the war. And I know this panel of people that are put together for these meetings, a lot of them have a lot of information about the EMP nuclear weapon and what it can do to the world or to the targeted area. But, you know, it only takes one of those to cause a great deal of economic distress. And so it's not just a matter of counting rounds, how many has Russia got versus how many we've got. Well, we know they have, we believe they have a much greater count than we have. But it only takes one or two of the EMP type rounds. And gosh, I've been retired so long, I don't have a clearance, and I'm not even sure of what other kinds of capabilities the Russians have in their nuclear arsenal. But it certainly is a subject that we need to have control of and not allow ourselves to get into a nuclear exchange with Russia. And well, the current administration gives me great anguish because of what I see them do, and I wonder, why are they doing these crazy things? Are they doing it because they've actually given up? So that's just a couple of my thoughts I'd like to share with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your thoughts. Yes, Helga.
Well, actually, I'm glad you're bringing this up because, as you know, the title of this conference is 100 Seconds on the Doomsday Clock. And that is an estimate which is published in the Bulletin of Nuclear Scientists. And they renewed this judgment on the 20th of January this year. And then if you look at the maneuver called Global Lightning, which started actually in the last days of January, and it went into the beginning of February. And the scenario of this maneuver is a protracted nuclear war. This is all top secret. This was revealed by two journalists and Hans Christensen commenting about it in Newsweek, naturally only about those things which could be known, which is not a lot. But whatever is known is that, it is based on the idea that you can have a protracted nuclear war mixed with conventional war, mixed with neutron bombs, with cyber war, with attacks from space, and various components. And the idea is that one or the other side could make a nuclear attack. The other side absorbs that nuclear attack, then retaliates. The other side absorbs it. And so the combat is supposed to go on back and forth. And then naturally the idea is that one side is then winning a limited nuclear war. I think this is absolutely crazy. I read many of the articles published on the subject of the difference between conventional and nuclear war. And Ted Postol, for example, makes the argument that there is a fundamental difference between the two, that a conventional war, you can stop at a certain point and, basically halt. But he argues that it's the very nature of nuclear war that once you start using one nuclear weapons, that all will be used. So we are really looking, once you start such a thing, you are looking potentially at the annihilation of the human species. And even the idea to have a rehearsal about that seems to be completely insane, and there's no discussion about it, or almost no discussion about it. And if anybody of the panelists would have something to say about it, I would be very appreciative.
Okay, let's see. Well, what I'd like to ask at this point is for the panelists to respond to Helga, but what we want to do now is to wind up, so we want this to be sort of summary remarks. And I'd like to start with Mr. Nielsen.
Yes, first I would very much like to thank the Schiller Institute for giving me the opportunity to take part in this very, very interesting conference. I think it's been extremely interesting to hear from various parts of the world. And I think it's absolutely sure, and it has convinced me even more that we are very close to what might be doomsday. So I think it's very, very important, and I'm very glad. And I don't think I can add something new to the debate, apart from the fact that it's very, very important that we sort of collect our resources to impose a new multipolar world order. Again, thank you very much for a very, very interesting conference.
Thank you very much as well. Colonel Corvez.
So, I want to say that the remark of Helga Zepp-LaRouche was very accurate and very important, that nuclear war is impossible between nations because it's the end of the world. But some experts, and especially in America, in the Pentagon, had tried before, some years before, to say that okay, we can use just a small nuclear warhead just to get some success somewhere, but we don't start a global nuclear war. And as Helga Zepp-LaRouche said, this is impossible. Nuclear is a global arm, and this is a very important fact, because in the history of humanity, it's the first time that men invented, created a new weapon which was not possible to use when two nations, at least two or more, have also another nuclear warhead. This is something. The dissuasion is something very important. It means that United States can no more impose his will to any country which have also a nuclear war. Then that's why the United States is trying to use proxies to get his targets. But the main target, the main purpose of United States for the moment is to try to preserve its domination of the world, especially the economic world. Somebody said something very, very clever before, that a multipolar world is an economics world where nations exchange in the interest of each other, of all the nations. And such an economics world should be established as soon as possible. But for the moment, United States have dominated the world with the dollar. You know, all the sanctions that they have put to different persons, different nations, different organizations in the world, because they have used dollar in their transactions, which were not approved by Washington. Then the war in Ukraine at this moment is also a war to preserve the supremacy of dollar in all the economical transaction. But now Russia, China, and other countries have started to say we can use our own currency or create a new system of economical exchange between us. And that is why also, this is also the reason for the threat and the pressure that United States put in the Ukrainian crisis, is to preserve, to sustain the supremacy of dollar and the supremacy of the global economical finance, which is based in Wall Street and in the city in London.
Thank you. Mr. Rameh.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, the Schiller Institute and Ms. Helga, especially because I'm here due to their invitation. So I just want to put forward one or two things. Number one, so Ukraine is not the only issue which need to be tackled. I think USA and its allies are also pushing India to go for a conflict with China. If you look at the Golan, what is happening on the border of India and China. And they are engaging India in the Quad, 2+2, and so many other initiatives to push them. So their agenda is very clear. It's not about the Ukraine. Their agenda is very clear. To create something, or you create some conflict to make a lot of money, as some of my friends were talking about. So we have to address this mentality. And second, their arrogance. Arrogance of US elite class, and you can say other elite class. I can give you one example. US was asking Pakistan to give them assistance to evacuate from Afghanistan, but Mr. Biden refused to talk with the Prime Minister of Pakistan. So that is their arrogance. So these two, economics, arrogance, and the self-interest, these are things the situation is, these things are making situation difficult. I think the real contribution would be to decode these conditions and build our own campaign. We don't need to try, definitely the Western media, they have the more influence on the world, but the social media, some other platform, we can also create some influence. Thank you.
All right, Harley Schlanger.
Well, I was reflecting on a discussion I had with Helga the other day where she said, in times like this, we're living caught between fear and hope. And while we must never succumb to fear, it is legitimate to be fearful of the consequences of the actions of the West in pushing for this war confrontation with Russia. But it can also serve as a wake-up call, as an impetus to do something. And so we must not be afraid to talk to people about the actual danger that exists there. But hope is the other part of this. And there's a poem by Friedrich Schiller called Hope, Hoffnung, which has the line in it which always stirs something within me where he says, "We are born for that which is better." And it's that recognition of the potential of other human beings, with reflecting back through history the struggles that people went through to create a world where we can have 7.5 billion people, where we have beautiful works of art and music and scientific advances. And what has driven that is a love of mankind and hope for the future. So I think even as we reflect on the real dangers of war and act against it, the best weapon we have is to give people hope based on that sense of the common interests of all mankind.
Helga?
Well, even if this is not the main subject of this panel, for me, the credibility of the so-called Western liberal system, which already was not exactly the highest mark because of what happened to my husband, Lyndon LaRouche, who was treated by a justice system with a complete absence of any justice. And now you see something different but similar happening with Julian Assange. So there are these credibility questions, but what really gets to me as the final test is what happens with Afghanistan. Here you have the biggest humanitarian crisis on the planet, where, according to the World Food Programme, 25 million people are in danger of starvation, and 1 million children under the age of 5 are in a condition where they would, if they would be in Germany, would have to be in the intensive care unit, according to the German UNICEF representative. Naturally, there are no intensive care units in Afghanistan, so the likelihood that these children will die is unfortunately extremely high. And the West knows it. How much would be needed to stop that? According to the UN, a meager $5 billion would be necessary. Now, what is $5 billion for a military budget of $800 billion per year, or for the billions of these multi-billionaires with their big yachts? David Beasley from the World Food Programme has actually appealed to Bezos and Gates and these people that they should just give a tiny percentage of their fortune, and the whole crisis in Afghanistan could be solved. So for me, the West, knowing what is going on and the relatively very little effort it would take to remedy it and save 25 million people, and altogether maybe even more, because 98% of the Afghan population is going hungry and is not getting enough food. I think that is the moral test, and I think the longer they allow this humanitarian crisis to go on, the less prestige they have, in my view, and in the eyes of the world, I'm sure.
We'd like to thank our panelists, Natalia Vitrenko of Ukraine, Colonel Alain Corvez of France, Jens Jørgen Nielsen of Denmark, James Jatras of the United States, and Shakil Ahmad Rameh of Pakistan for being with us today. And of course, Harley Schlanger and Helga Sepp-LaRouche. We are now at the conclusion of our panel, and we will be reconvening here at 2 p.m. Eastern Time and 8 p.m. Central European Time for panel 2, which is called Crafting a New Strategic Architecture, the Russian-Chinese February 4th Joint Agreement, the World Land Bridge Economic Development Perspective. That will be keynoted by Helga Sepp-LaRouche. So we welcome you all to be with us at that time. Let everybody know in the 45 minutes you have left about that panel, and we will see you shortly. Oh, I meant to thank these other guys.